access it later. So thanks, Ben. Let's start the recording. And then Ben, do you take us to the next slide? Great. So just to give an overview of what we'll be discussing today, we'll start with an overview of the 401(o)(1)D program, and then we'll talk about the activities that Mass CEC has undertaken so far. Then we'll discuss the proposed changes to the program narrative or Massachusetts' plan for how it's going to implement this funding. And then finally, we will have time for public comment at the end. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Please stay on mute if you're not speaking. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat throughout, and we can answer them when we get to the public comment portion. Attendees will have the opportunity to ask questions or provide comment live when we get to the end of the session. And as I said, the session will be recorded and will be posted on our website after we conclude. Next slide, please, Ben. Great. So some background about the program. The 401(o)(1)D federal formula funding program, also called Preventing Outages and Enhancing the Resilience of the Electric Grid, is targeted at enhancing the resilience and reliability of the grid. It was established as part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, in 2021 under Section 401(d). So this funding opportunity is a formula funding opportunity, meaning it's non-competitive. So each state and tribe is eligible for annual distributions of funding for 5 years between fiscal year 2022 and fiscal year 2026. And each state is eligible for a specific amount of funding that the federal government has determined. So the Massachusetts allocation is approximately $4.5 million annually. The period of performance is 5 years for projects initially, though DOE has announced that there will be some flexibility and may allow to 10 years to allow subawardees to complete their project activities. The goals of the funding are to enhance the resilience of the electric grid, prevent outages, and mitigate the impact of disruptive events. Thus far, Massachusetts has been awarded its fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23 formula funding allocation, totaling $9.2 million. And as I kind of alluded to before, the program is broad, and states and tribes have some leeway to figure out how they're going to implement the funding. So the Commonwealth has defined 4 objectives for the program: to improve energy reliability and resilience, support decarbonization efforts, advance environmental justice, and create good-paying clean energy jobs. I'll also note that the Massachusetts program has been developed more with resilience in mind, and we're specifically interested in focusing on building level resilience. However, as we'll get to, there are a wide breadth of eligible funding or eligible activities under the funding program, and all applications involving any of those activities will be considered. Next slide, please. A couple more housekeeping things. So the legislation has defined the following entities as eligible subawardees of the funding. So these are electric grid operators, electricity storage operators, electricity generators, transmission owners or operators, distribution providers, fuel suppliers, and any other relevant entity as determined by the Secretary of DOE. If organizations are interested in applying for the funding as any other relevant entity, please get in touch with us and we can work through that together. Next slide, please. And then these are the activities that the legislation has defined as eligible uses of this funding. So I'll just give folks a moment to read over these. All right, next slide, please. And then one other thing that I wanted to note is that the legislation also divides eligible subawardees into large and small entities. And they have defined this as small entities are eligible subawardees that do not sell more than 4 million megawatt hours of electricity annually. And large entities are those that sell more than 4 million megawatt hours of electricity annually, or who do not sell any electricity. This is important because the legislation requires the states to make funding available to small utilities proportionate to the number of customers in the territory who are served by those utilities. In Massachusetts, approximately 59% of customers are served by small utilities. This was determined using data from the Energy Information Administration, which is the recommended DOE source for determining the set aside. So if anyone is curious about more information about that data source, we do have a link to it on our website. So accordingly, 59% of the funding will be made available to small entities. Next slide, please. So next, we'll just walk through the status of the program thus far in Massachusetts. So we developed our program narrative or our implementation plan and held our first public hearing and accepted public comment on it in January of last year. We received our fiscal year 2022 and 2023 allocation in August. And since then, we've been developing the RFP for this program. So we started with some draft program guidelines that we released in December, and we collected public comment on those guidelines until February. In March, we responded to all the questions that we received during that time and posted the responses to those questions on our website. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the present. So we have a couple of things going on concurrently with the program right now. This month, we will be submitting our application for our fiscal year 2024 allocation, which will be approximately $4.3 million. And we also anticipate releasing the request for proposals this spring. We do anticipate that the release of this solicitation will be the first of several rounds of solicitations for this funding. We anticipate that the first round of subawards will be made between 4 to 6 months after the application deadline. And then we anticipate that we will open the solicitation and make subawards semi-annually each year until the funding is exhausted, though this timeline is subject to change. Next slide, please. So as part of our fiscal year 2024 application, we'll be submitting a program narrative, and we have proposed to make a couple of changes to it, explaining the timing of this meeting. So those changes deal with the cost match required of subawardees. The legislation has set a required subawardee cost match for each entity. So they've set it at 100% of the award for large entities and 1/3 of the award for small entities. However, Massachusetts is proposing to amend the required cost match for subawardees to set it between 100 and 115% of the award for large entities, and between 1/3 and 1/3 plus 15% of the award for small entities. The exact required cost match within those specified ranges would be determined upon subaward notification. So this change would be reflected in the updated program narrative that we submit to DOE as part of our application. If you'd like to read the proposed changes within the context of the program narrative, you can find the draft version on our website. So just to explain a little bit more about why we've proposed this change, Massachusetts and all the other states are required to match 15% of the award that we receive from DOE. So in the event that the Commonwealth can't provide the required cost share, it may pass the cost share on to subawardees. So the update in the program narrative just allows us the flexibility to get the cost share from that source. So that concludes the presentation portion of our meeting today. So we can now move into public comment. Ben, if you could go to the next slide, please. So I'll open the floor to attendees to ask questions or provide comment. If you'd like to ask a question or provide a comment live, please raise your hand using the raise hand function, and we'll call on folks in the order that hands are raised. You may also type your comments or questions in the chat, and we will respond to them. We are also accepting written comment until 5 p.m. on April 11th, so that's a week from today. And you can submit those comments to grid@masscec.com. Thank you. Can turn it over to questions now. Yes, Mike.
Hey, thanks again for having this. Exciting news that it sounds like this is going to be hopefully like a recurring annual program for you guys. I was just wondering if there'd be any restrictions on an entity's ability to, apply for or receive an award for multiple years. Say an entity were to apply this year and get an award this year, would they potentially be able to do that again the next year, or would either of those two things rule them out from applying again?
To my knowledge, there aren't restrictions on how many times an entity can apply or be awarded.
Awesome, thanks.
Great question. Does the project need to be located in a municipal territory to be considered a small entity? No. So the way this works is that the subawardee receiving the funding needs to qualify as a small utility under the DOE definition of selling some electricity that is less than 4 million megawatt hours annually to be considered a small entity. Yeah, Mike.
Sorry, I figured I'd ask them not in order. So you mentioned that it'd be about 4 to 6 months after the application deadline that you guys would make the announcements. Approximately like how long of that 4 to 6 months will be oh, sorry, you know what? I just answered my own question. I was going to ask about how long after the RFP is released do you think the deadline will be? And I just realized that is separate from that 4 to 6 month period that you mentioned. So if you have any initial feeling of how long after the RFP is released that we'll have to submit an application, that would be helpful for us, just internal resourcing planning.
Yeah, absolutely. It looks like we have a question in the chat about that too. I think we're currently envisioning about a quarter or 90 days to leave the application period open, though that hasn't been finalized yet and may still be subject to change.
Awesome. Thanks for clarifying.
Any other questions? All right, the program listed battery storage. Does this also encompass other types of energy storage, or are you only considering typical battery and energy storage system storage type technologies? That's a good question. I'm not sure that the legislation specifies any specific technologies that would be required under the program. But if you have a specific question about technology, please feel free to get in touch with us and we can confirm. Also from the chat, how does the application process compare to applying for a DOE grant like GRIP? Could you describe it in more detail? Yes. So the application process will at first be run entirely through Mass CEC. So we have, with the RFP, we'll release a suite of application forms with it that will be required as part of the application. And then Mass CEC will make subaward recommendations to DOE, and then all of our subaward recommendations are subject to approval by DOE. But please let me know if you have further questions about that process. Could you go back to, oh, sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to say well, Ben, while I'm answering, you can go back to the technology areas. Yeah. But in terms of it being comparable to applying for other DOE grants, we do pass through all of the federal contracting and reporting requirements to subawardees. So to the extent you're familiar with any of those, like Built by America and Davis-Bacon requirements, along with some other ones, including metrics reporting, those are all passed through us via the federal grant.
Yeah, great point. Thank you, Sarah. Yes, Andrew.
All right. I'll ask this one in person this time. Thanks for answering my questions. The first one about the small entity requirement, I get that it's based on sort of annual electricity sales. Can you provide any further guidance on what those territories actually are? So there's probably most every muni in the state, probably FG&E. What other territories are we talking about?
So the EIA data that the federal government uses to define that 4 million cutoff and who falls in which category. I think that for the most recent year's data, I believe it's only National Grid that is considered large. It's either National Grid or Eversource. I forget which one. I think National Grid is the larger of the two. Yeah. In the previous year, Eversource was considered large as well. They're like right on the cusp. So basically every other entity that's considered on that list is small. It's a pretty high threshold to make. But the kind of the one of the weird aspects of it is that if an entity doesn't sell any electricity, they're by default considered large. So something like a storage operator, for example, is considered an eligible entity, but it's possible that a storage operator doesn't have any type of operation that sells electricity.
Okay.
If that makes sense. So the list is also not it doesn't include every single possible subawardee. So if an entity is not explicitly listed in that EIA data, what we can do is request kind of an assessment by DOE of whether they are considered large or small based on some kind of justification and data that's provided by that subawardee or the applicant.
Okay, great, thank you.
And I forget the exact name of the data set, but it's definitely on the website. It's in the RFP. It's linked there. I can also look for that right now if it's helpful.
Any other questions? All right. Hearing none, Sarah, is there any other final things you wanted to mention?
I don't think so.
Great.
I will
All right,
drop in the
well-
chat that EIA data if it's of interest.
Great. Thank you. Yes, that's correct. Not all of the MLPs are listed on the EIA data set. So if an applicant is an MLP that isn't listed, please just get in touch with us and we can work on figuring that out.
Yeah, it's unclear to us whether or what is the determining factor in who is included or not. It's a survey, it's survey data that the EIA collects. I don't know, and DOE also was not able to help us better understand what subset of potential utility entities are kind of included in that survey. So it's a black box, but there is ways to, if you're not listed, like I said, we can work with DOE to figure out the classification.
Yeah,
Andrew?
Andrew, go ahead.
All right, my last question on this topic, since there will be like multiple rounds of this, that 59%, 41% small, large split, are you anticipating if there's sort of an overage in one round, that the next round, do you try to like balance it back? Like,
Yeah, I think it'll be the program as a whole has to meet those metrics. And so over however many rounds there are, will be kind of at the end of when all awards are made, those metrics will have to be met. So the same would go for like the Justice 40 target. If we don't, it might be that the first round of awards doesn't have 40% going to Justice 40 communities, or it could be more than 40%. It's just by the end of the entire awards process, over however many years we get awarded, the final metrics will work out to that.
okay, great, thank you.
I'm happy to answer any final questions if folks have them. Otherwise, we will be sending out the slide deck to folks that have registered. It's also posted on our website, and the recording will also be posted on our website if you'd like to reference it at any time.
Someone did just join. If you came with a specific question and want to ask it, please feel free. But we were just wrapping up otherwise. I'll give it one more minute before we close things out. Or I guess, Corinne, will we stay on till 1, I guess, in case people join? No, okay. All right, hearing none.
Yeah, I think we can close it out. And if anything occurs to you that you didn't ask today, but you'd like to have answered, you can always feel free to send us an email at grid@masscac.com. Thanks very much, everyone.